The conclusion from this paper, which was NASA based with the great satellites, as I say, is this: continued warming of the planet will cause more frequent, more severe, longer, and larger droughts and pluvials, which is floods caused by heavy precipitation. So there you have it. That's the last word. It's going to be worse, and a lot worse.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'll be your host for today's show. But before we get started, if you haven't, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to our channel. Our numbers are growing, and we want you to be a part of our continually growing audience. So, on with our show. This has been one heck of a summer. As you know, we started off with tremendous fires. My God, we just had a huge fire in Hawaii, but let's not forget Canada. There were actually close to 6,000 fires that have consumed over 15 million hectares of land. This is unprecedented. Well, this is what happens when we have increasing heat and the time of global warming. But that's not all. One of the very, very sad tragedies is that our climate crises are not limited to just one form. We have heat, we have fires, and my gosh, do we have flooding. Our show today, Ferocious Flooding, because it has been nothing short of ferocious. We've just come off of a tailspin of Hurricane Hilary that has done tremendous damage. But that is not all. That's not all. We've had flooding in Slovenia, for goodness sakes, flooding in Ireland, China, Norway, and Ottawa. What are the causes of this flooding? Well, we do know that with increased heat, the atmosphere holds more moisture. More moisture in the atmosphere means that there is more moisture that can come down upon us in the form of rain. We all know this instinctually. When we take our showers, we leave the bathroom, there's moisture in the air. It's in the form of humidity. That's what we're doing to our planet all around us. It's very, very scary, and it's very dangerous. Another form of flooding that we really need to account for is poor planning. What do I mean by that? Well, I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Forgive me, fellow Houstonians who may be watching this, but when you pave over all of the grass, all of the dirt, everything that's living, and just have pavement, well, when it rains, where does the water go? It has nowhere to go but up into our streets and into our homes. So that is another way that we suffer from these terrible floods. This is, of course, highly preventable. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we'll be lucky enough to get some commentary from Paul about some of the ways that we can mitigate the dangers of these floods. Another thing that can contribute to flooding is when we decimate the land. What do I mean by that? So we're not laying road, we're not paving paradise, but when there's no leafy green, so to speak, in the ground, that ground becomes hard pack. Water, it won't absorb the water that falls down, and it'll act just like pavement. The water will just roll over it and flood. We saw this in the devastating floods, I believe, of Pakistan. Erosion was one of the reasons of the tremendous flooding. We've seen this type of flooding in a lot of areas where vegetation has been decimated. There are so many reasons, but I will absolutely like to stick with one of the most important reasons for the purposes of this show today, and that is global warming, the warming of the atmosphere, and the output of rain into our environment. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter. I know he's done a lot of research on this. Peter, what do you have to share with us on this topic?
Well, what I can say is that what you have just said, as you well know, we've practically known forever. For example, in the very first IPCC assessment in 1990, they projected that there would be increased pluvial floods. Those are the ones that occur because we're getting more heavy rainfall, and that we would have more coastal floods because of sea level rise. So that was predicted by the scientists back in 1990. Paul's going to talk about what we are doing or could do or should do about it, but I just want to say we're doing absolutely nothing about it, right? Governments are doing nothing about mitigation because that requires some major infrastructure and works. And of course, governments are doing worse than nothing as regards real mitigation because they're just pushing more and more fossil fuels. And we will then get more and more floods, more and more droughts, more and more forest fires. So there was a good paper 10 years ago, I guess, in 2013, and it was a global flood risk under climate change. So I took another look at it, and it really is quite amazing. So I just want to go through a list, and it's quite an amazing list, and it does certainly prove that increased flooding is going to happen anywhere and everywhere. The United States, southeast and coastal west United States, Quebec, Latin America, most of South America, especially Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, and eastern Argentina, all of Central Africa, actually more than all of Central Africa, because the risk area here goes right down to Tanzania and Mozambique. Madagascar, the UK, France, Eastern Russia, that being Siberia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, which is a huge country, all of China and the south of China being at much higher risk of worse floods. China's, of course, already seen catastrophic floods, basically. All of the Indochina Peninsula, that's the countries of Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, those countries are very, very high risk there. They're going to get severe floods on the temperature increase, the global warming that we're already committed to is totally unavoidable. Indonesia is going to get a lot of floods. Pakistan, well, that doesn't show up very well on this projection, but we know Pakistan is going to get more floods surely. Bangladesh, of course, all of the Indian continent, and that will be according to the projections and what India is seeing actually recently this year, much heavier monsoon. And so they're going to be very, very difficult to deal with, and they'll be damaging, and they already have been. So that's sort of a list, it's a hit list of how global warming is going to hit the entire world with respect to floods. I just want to finish off by mentioning a great study which was published this year, and it was a study using the amazingly clever and smart, which Paul can talk about more than I can, the GRACE satellites up in space. These satellites are quite amazing. They're able to tell us the amount of water affecting the whole planet and also regionally, groundwater and also surface water. And the projections from the GRACE satellites are actually totally reliable. They're even more reliable than the drought monitors that we have based on land. They're quite amazing. So the conclusion from this paper, which was NASA-based with the great satellites, as I say, is this: continued warming of the planet will cause more frequent, more severe, longer, and larger droughts and pluvials, which is floods caused by heavy precipitation. So there you have it. That's the last word. It's going to be worse, and a lot worse.
Thank you, Peter. Of course, we take no joy in hearing that. I'm certain you take no joy in saying that. It's very, very scary, especially if you look at in terms of our modern infrastructure. We're just not prepared for this. I remember 2 years ago, there was a flash flooding here in New York City, and my station, subway station right by me, was practically like a swimming pool. People were in waist-high water. we did a show on this, and there was actually a new subway in China that also flooded tremendously. There were people who were stuck underground. So it's no joke, folks. This is serious stuff we're talking about here. And Paul, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts in terms of mitigation and what we can do to deal with what we've got coming to us.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I'll just do a little bit of a recap of some of the details of the flooding in various places around the world. So Slovenia was hit hard about 2 weeks ago. About 2/3 of the country was affected by the massive flooding. Rivers overflowed their banks, towns along the rivers got inundated, and it's a small country, so there was huge infrastructure damage, which which will take years to recover from, and they're at great risk of course, repeats. Just exactly the same thing happening when there's torrential rains in the region. A great website is called floodlist.com, and you can look at an article about Chile recently. So 30,000 people evacuated. Basically, a strong weather frontal system went through, along with an atmospheric river. We know about the jet streams slowing and becoming wavier, et cetera. There's more atmospheric rivers in places like on the west coast of North America, but also in places like Chile. So an atmospheric river dumped up to about 1/3 of a meter of rain in some regions. It was the second major flood in 8 weeks in the country. And of course, rivers broke their banks. There was lots of mudslides and landslides and infrastructure damage. Norway is another place affected just a few weeks ago. An actual power station dam, the Brasker Rydfoss power dam. The dam actually collapsed, and it's, I believe, the Glommen River. Basically, there was lots of stuff swept away. They're having the highest river levels in 50 years for this particular flooding event. A railroad bridge collapsed between Oslo and Trondheim, which is the third largest city. Trondheim, of course, Oslo, the capital. There were strong winds. There was many landslides and cascading failures of the system, the infrastructure for transportation, for power, etc. Of course, the USA is in the news with Storm Hilary. Incredible rainfall amounts, over 4.3 inches in 24 hours in Palm Springs, which represents a year of rainfall in a day. Death Valley, even, we think of it as one of the driest places on the planet, about 1.7 inches. Nevada had the rainiest tropical system, the remnants of Tropical Storm Hilary. They broke the state's 116-year-old rainfall record was broken by a factor of 2. It wasn't just exceeded partially or in a small fashion, broken by a factor of 2, twice as much rain. Also records in Idaho, Montana, Oregon as the storm worked its way across the US. The UK had to withstand Storm Betty, 66-mile-an-hour winds, lots of damage, rivers, overflowing banks, etc. But Beijing, we don't get a lot of news from China. The government suppresses it, but there was Typhoon Doksuri, and it dumped huge amounts of rain in the Beijing area and the northeast China region. A region the size roughly as Britain was inundated. 1.2 million people were evacuated. 140-year-old rainfall records were broken. And again, it's swollen rivers, waterlogged cities. A city near Beijing called Zuozhou, it was the worst hit place. About 1/6 of the city was evacuated. It's a city of about 600,000 people. The reservoirs, the large and medium reservoirs, their capacity was exceeded by a factor of 2 with this rainfall. So it's just the volume of rain falling was just so huge. There was just nowhere for it to be stored. So of course it ran over land. And of course, now we have Tropical Storm Franklin, which is hitting the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Now, those two places share the island of Hispaniola. Haiti was basically clear-cut. The Dominican still has some forests. 12 inches of rain expected from this storm, ongoing right as we speak. Flash floods, landslides, and Haiti always gets hit way worse if there's an equivalent amount of rainfall because there's no trees and vegetation holding the soils together, so there's huge landslides. Now, I just want to say that, a lot of these storms, a lot of these flooding events occur along rivers and the coast, and we can get accurate measurements of the topography. So we can use something called LIDAR, which is laser radar. Small instruments flown in, say, small aircraft like a Cessna or something, they can fly over a region and map to the millimeter the topography. So we know whenever there's huge amounts of rainfall where that water is going to go. We know how much the rivers are going to go up. We can calculate the parts of the rivers that will burst their banks, the weak spots, etc. And we can become proactive, and we can actually harden the infrastructure and river systems, etc., so that these catastrophic floods, we know there's going to be catastrophic amounts of rainfall, but that doesn't mean there has to be a catastrophic flood. If we put the engineers to work and are smart, we just have to figure out where the water can be dumped so it has minimal impacts on cities and infrastructure. So there's a lot of work that municipalities and provinces and countries can do to mitigate these floods. Like I said, the vast majority are from rivers overflowing their banks.
Thank you so much, Paul. I mean, I think it's really, really important, as you suggest, to look at the solutions. Look at the solutions that can really be helpful in this situation. And we did a show on this. I believe it was a couple of years back. And one of the things that was recommended was bioswales. And bioswales are very, very important because, as we've just expressed, and as Paul just said, when this rain comes down, it comes down hard. The landscape is degraded. It just runs everywhere. And that groundwater, that ever important groundwater, does not get replaced. If we were to, or if various governments or entities were to implement bioswales, it would be a wonderful thing for migrating birds, animals, insects, and it could help mitigate flooding and at the same time increase the capacity, not the capacity, but increase the underground reservoirs that are so important. And as we know, they're not important just for maintaining water supply, but major cities who have had their groundwater depleted, such as Jakarta, are actually sinking. So we could do so much good if we just used our brains. We're Homo sapiens, knowing beings. If we would just do this, it would be at least helpful. Now, I know, Peter, that we are in a bad situation, but we have to look at some solutions. So I would like to hear more of your research on the situation with global warming and flooding.
Certainly, we can adapt, but it's, as I say, there are major undertakings. So governments would have to get involved in adaptation projects, and particularly around water, as Paul has described. Paul also reminded me of what the IPCC projected. And yeah, he's right. At 1.5 and 2 degrees C, we're going to get these floods that double the frequency that we've been experiencing. So absolutely massive increase. And the intensity, the amount of water, the IPCC said that there will be an extra 14% of intensity. That's actually huge. And I just want to remind us that we will be, no matter what the political leaders and scientists say, we're going to be at 1.5 degrees C soon after 2030. And that's what these 6 assessments said. So we really do have to get down to serious work. But none of these adaptation projects, I'm afraid, are going to last for very long, at least, if we allow our governments and corporations to keep on polluting the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. We're at record high amounts of fossil fuel CO2 emissions, record high, right? And all countries are increasing their emissions because they're increasing their production of fossil fuels, particularly including Canada and China. For example, this most recent quarter in China, emissions were record high again. But not only that, I read that China is permitting again 2 coal plants every week. So we have to do something mighty powerful, or somebody has to do something mighty powerful to force our governments to stop destroying our future and to stop wrecking our planet.
Thank you. That's such an important message. And yes, it's very disheartening with China in regards to coal. Sometimes it's really difficult to keep a positive outlook, or even just, I don't know what the word is in our current situation. But these things are the challenge of our time. Paul, would you close us out, please?
Yes. So, I mentioned a few of the things that we can do to adapt to the torrential rainfall events leading to flooding. We need to accurately determine, measure physically the topography, okay, the change of land with altitude, not just regional topography, but also, for example, city topography. We know if a city gets inundated with torrential rains, like Ottawa about a month ago or less, the water's got to go to the lowest points of the city, which is underpasses, of course, and we'll go to neighborhoods within the city that are at lower levels. And generally in cities, the higher ground is occupied by more expensive, larger houses that are owned by the wealthy of the city. In the lower areas of the city are often areas that are less wealthy. So the poorest people in the cities often are in the lowest areas. Just look at New Orleans, for example. And during any flooding event, they're the ones that get their places devastated, their neighborhoods devastated. In terms of the physics, it's very simple for the climate. Warm air holds more water vapor. If the area is a degree Celsius warmer, it holds about 7% more water vapor. So there's an exponential increase in water vapor as temperature rises. So of course, the biggest mitigation method is to lower the temperature to prevent this temperature from spiraling upwards. And we know in the next few years it's going to be extremely risky for people on this planet in many places because of the huge warming spikes that are expected. And I'll again refer you to James Hansen's work, Global Warming in the Pipeline, but also more recently an article he wrote about how the El Nino and lack of Antarctic sea ice and reduction of aerosols and all these factors are spiking up temperatures in the next year and a half, 2 years. Coastlines with sea level rise, apart from reducing emissions and reducing the rate of sea level rise, coastlines, basically building seawalls is just a fool's game because, how high do you build them? You don't really know how quickly the water will rise. So I love Tommy Lee Jones's statement in the movie Volcano. The coast is toast is one point. He's talking about lava flow to the coast, but I think it's apt for climate. So we're going to see more and more of these floods. We know that wetter areas get wetter, drier areas get drier, right? The distribution of water on the planet is changing. The whole hydrology is changing. The water stored in soils and vegetation is completely changing. And as Peter's mentioned, we have been depleting groundwater significantly over large parts of the planet. So ways to use some of these torrential rains to replenish groundwater is something that we really need to think about. And, ways to store water when there's huge amounts of water. I mean, we know we can figure out easily where river banks will burst, and we can figure out where that water will go once the river bank bursts, what's in the way, and strengthen or harden those areas of the river, the weaker areas. We have to force some people to move. People on low-level areas next to rivers and things, we should never have built there in the first place. We'll never get insurance soon. Insurance companies are not going to be around forever. They're losing buckets of money from all of these catastrophes.
Thank you for that summation. And aside from the extreme displacement that people will experience aside from the fact that these floods will continually drive ever more pollution into our waterways, these flooding events are very, very costly, very expensive. They wipe highways right off their foundations, homes off their foundations, and they disrupt lives for a long period of time. I mean, think about it. Paul mentioned a city in China, 600,000 people were affected. Let's think about the schools that are wiped away, teachers who have no homes or to go to or classrooms to go to. How are the students going to learn? And how will this affect them as they grow up? These learning gaps don't close easily. So it's really a very, very serious problem. I'm glad that you were with us here today so that you could learn more about the flooding events that we had in this crazy 2023 in the summer. And so that you can have an understanding that there will be more of these ahead for us to look forward to. I say that loosely. It's not something to look forward to. And I hope that if you learned something from this video, that you will like this video to help us with the algorithm and share it with a friend who may live in a flood-prone area or knows others who do. And as always, we very much appreciate you joining with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.